barkada ay itutuloy hanggang sa matapos ang hurika ng mga prepare ng jeepney. Inaasahan namin na kayo ay muling magkaisa sa makabayang simulan ng makipaka para sa mga Pilipino. Makipaka mula sa mga mag-aaral at sa kataang nasa mga barikada ng bayan.
This is what we do. Tell stories.
Ay kwento natin lang.
We tell them in words,
DZUP 1602, ang opisyal na istasyong radyo.
music,
Music Fix and DZUP Sound
images, and experiences. We tell them on air,
Sa coverage, mga
online, and on ground. We tell stories of the people. We tell stories for the people. We tell the stories of the university,
Pagpasok sa UP para maglingkod sa bahay.
of the community, of the nation, and even beyond.
On VOA Asia as we
World
celebrate
College Radio Day.
We tell what we know, what we see, what we cover, and what we discover. We tell the stories of those who can't.
nating mga kababayang lumad ay kolektibong katawagan.
We tell the stories that should be told,
nating epekto nitong train law para sa ating mga may hirap na kami.
should be heard,
Ang mensahe ko sa mga bata at sa mga magulang, alamin natin ang kasaysayan.
and should be known.
Outright na pagkitil sa media, ito ay isang malaking
We tell stories that are true,
Mga pangyayaring kaugnay
Related
ng
violence.
tinatawag nating diliman commune,
stories that question, stories that transform.
Instead of 55, we should say
This is what we do. Tell your stories for you, with you. This is our story.
Bilib ako doon sa mga nananatili para pagsilbihan ng UP.
We're not just radio. We are DZUP.
Kalinsabay ng pagdiriwang ng pambansang buwan ng sining sa darating na Pebrero 2021, gugunitain ng Universidad ng Pilipinas ang dalawang mahahalagang engkwentro sa kasaysayan ng Pilipinas, ang Diliman Commune noong 1971 at ang pagtatagpo ng Pilipinas at Espanya noong 1521. Nihahandog ng UP Diliman Opisina ng Chancellor at UP Diliman Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts, ang UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival 2021. Enkwentro, Barikada 50 at 500 taon ng pagtatagpo ng Pilipinas at Espanya, nagaganapin mula Pebrero hanggang Abril 2021. Hinihimok ang mga scholar ng bayan na pagnilayan sa pamamagitan ng mga proyektong pangsining at pangkultura ang mga pagtatagpo ng mga ideya at konsepto, palitan ng material at performatibong kultura, paglikha ng mga kolaborasyon na nagbibigay ng kritikal na perspektiba sa mga isyong pangkasaysayan at panlipunan, at pagsusulong ng mga talastasan ng mga manliksik, guro, mag-aaral at publiko. Sa kabila ng suliraning pangkalusugan, ang mga gawaing nakahanay ay nakasandig sa mga gawaing akademiko, suporta sa mga malikhaing gawa at pananaliksik ng mga kagaruan at estudyante, mga artista sa loob at labas ng universidad, at gayon din malay sa kapakanan o serbisyong publiko. Sa pamamagitan ng mga gawain ito, may pagpapatuloy hindi lamang ang dokumentasyon o pag-arkibo ng mga halagang datos, naratibo, malikhaing gawa at iba pang forma ng panaliksik, kundi mas sisiguro rin ang tradisyon ng mapanuri, malusog at matalas na pakikipagtalastasan ng universidad tungkol sa mga usapin at isyung nasyonal at global. Ang mga proyekto na nakapaloob sa festival ay mga online webinars, forum conferences, virtual exhibitions, digital and multimedia performance, art installation mula sa iba't ibang kolehiyo na nakikitaan ng interdisiplinaryong lapit mula sa iba't ibang disiplina. I-like at i-follow ang UP-OICA sa Facebook, Twitter at Instagram para sa updates ng hashtag UPD Arts Culture Festival 2021. Maraming salamat po.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this event today. I am Divine Indriga, your moderator for this event. The second Consuelo J. Paz Lecture is organized by the UP Department of Linguistics in celebration of the UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival 2021, helmed by the Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts. This year's theme is Encuentro and commemorates two important encounters in the history of the university and the country: the Barricada 50, or the 50th anniversary of the Diliman Commune, at ika-500 taon na pagtatagpo ng Pilipinas at Espanya, a remembrance of the 500th anniversary of the Philippines being a part of the first circumnavigation of the world, the victory at Mactan, and the introduction of Christianity in the country. The commemoration encourages a reflection on the encounters of ideas and concepts, exchanges of material and performative cultures, and collaborations that produce critical perspectives on historical and social issues. This event is also in solidarity with the National Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. To formally open the event, let us welcome Professor Maria Bernadette L. Abrera, Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, for the opening remarks.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Isang karangalan para sa akin ang buksan itong ikalawang Consuelo Paz Lecture in her honor for her contributions to the discipline of linguistics in the Philippines. Si Dr. Paz, of course, alam natin ay dating dekano ng Kolehiyo ng Agham Panlipunan at Filosofiya. Nung ako ay isang instructor dito sa ating kolehiyo. I had the pleasure of attending the first Consuelo Paz Lecture 2 years ago on Ginhawa, delivered by Professor Tuting Hernandez, who is now the coordinator of the Folklore Studies program of CSSP. As a bit of prologue, the Folklore Studies program under Tuting just finished yesterday an international conference on Christianity and popular devotions, also in commemoration of the quincentennial of the entry of Christianity in the Philippines. There was a linguist presenter in that conference. She was the head of the Institute of Slavic Studies in Moscow. She is a linguist and a folklorist. This comes to mind now because folklore captures and reflects the people's lived experiences, and in like manner, so does language. So in my mind, these activities of the college related to the quincentennial celebrations are seamlessly joined as they are anchored on the Filipino character and historical identity. I had the opportunity of having read Dr. Arwin Vibar's dissertation as part of his oral examination panel, and the thorough work that he made was very striking for me, so that the loss of those volumes in the 2016 Faculty Center fire is one of the things that I regret until now. The recording of the Philippine languages by the first missionaries who came to evangelize the Philippines is a major legacy of the early Christian church, an undertaking that they continued until the 19th century. Those grammar and word lists for them was a result of the decision of the Manila Synod in 1582 to evangelize in the vernacular rather than in the colonial language. And we in the academe continue to reap the benefits from that. In history, for example, we cannot count the number of researches done by faculty and graduate students alike who continue to utilize those early dictionaries. It is indeed very fortunate to have Dr. Vibar share with us a part of his research from that dissertation. The Department of Linguistics should collaborate with him very soon to put that study out for the benefit of the greater public. Thank you. Happy birthday to Dean Connie Paz. Congratulations to Dr. Vibar and to the very vibrant Department of Linguistics under the chairmanship of Professor Jem Javier.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abrera. This lecture, held every 2 years, is in honor of Dr. Consuelo J. Paz, who may be considered as the grand dame of Philippine linguistics. She has numerous pioneering works on Philippine historical and comparative linguistics, social linguistics, and ethnolinguistics, which up to the present time have been regarded and cited by linguists, language planners, and Austronesianists in the Philippines and abroad. Some of her works are Gabay sa Fieldwork, Pag-aaral ng Wika, Ang Wikang Filipino, Atin Ito, and a reconstruction of Proto-Philippine phonemes and morphemes, her PhD dissertation that is now considered a milestone work in Philippine diachronic linguistics. She is the first Filipina diachronic linguist. A number of her articles were published outside the country, such as The Effects of Language on Social Structures, The Philippine Multilingual Scene, The Nationalization of a Language, Filipino, and a multidisciplinary study of stigma in relation to Hansen's disease among the Tausug. They are still presently used in graduate and undergraduate linguistics and language studies courses at UP. She served as Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy at UP Diliman for 2 terms and was instrumental in strengthening the connection between the scientific study of languages and other disciplines in the social sciences. She initiated the Programa sa Pag-aaral ng mga Ethnolinguistikong Grupo and the Center for International Studies. Her contributions to linguistic studies and cultural studies are invaluable. Dr. Consuelo Paz celebrated her 88th birthday last Wednesday, and she is here watching this lecture with us today. Before we proceed with the lecture, for the participants who would like to comment or ask questions, just post them in whichever platform you're watching from, either on Facebook or YouTube. Please keep the discussion a safe and civil space for everyone. We will also be issuing certificates of attendance upon submission of an evaluation form. The link will be posted in the comments later. Now, for the lecture, our speaker is Dr. Arwin Messina Vibar. He obtained his MA degree in English Studies, Language, and PhD in Linguistics from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He taught at the University of the Philippines, Manila, handling English communication courses for general education and linguistics for students of AP Organizational Communication, AB Behavioral Studies, AB Social Sciences, and BS Speech Pathology. His research outputs include studies on the major Philippine languages by Spanish missionaries, update on Chabacano, notes on the history of English language teaching at UP, a language-based approach to divide by two, and other short stories by Francisco Arceliana, and doctor-patient exchange structure, a discourse analysis. In 2017 to 2019, he served as an affiliate assistant professor at the Widya Mandala Catholic University, Surabaya, in Indonesia. Currently, he is an assistant professor at the University of Asia and the Pacific, wherein he is editor of Synergeia, the multi- or interdisciplinary academic journal of the university. He is also a professorial lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Manila. To deliver today's lecture, a thumbnail sketch of Philippine linguistics during the Spanish colonial period, let us welcome Dr. Arwin Vibar.
Hi. Does everybody see me now? Yes. Okay. Actually, without further ado, I'd like to start the lecture so that we can finish, because as you know very well, it's a thumbnail. It's a thumbnail sketch. Is going to be long. So, but we're going to try to shorten it so that there's still time for some question and answer at the end. Okay, so we can start. By your leave, Dean Abrera, Dean Consuelo Paz, and Jem, Department of Linguistics Chair, I'm going to start the lecture right now. Okay, so like I said, it's a thumbnail sketch. Is going to be long because what you want is to cover as many topics in Philippine linguistics during the time of the Spanish colonial period. So in this lecture, we shall show a bird's eye view. That's the abstract that I gave you. A bird's eye view of the linguistic activities at the time, and assume a worm's eye view of the main features of the principal languages as documented in representative grammar. So we're not going to look into vocabularies because the grammars themselves are so rich that we don't have. I don't have time. I mean, my lifetime is not enough in order to finish a study on it. So we start with the grammarian's positive response to the language problems occasioned by having a geographically dispersed population. Proceed to the language learning and description methods that the missionaries use, and conclude with an exposition of the grammars and a few of the grammatical elements described in them. So towards the end, we'll have to run a little bit. No? So to be precise, we shall follow this outline. So the lecture has 3 parts only, but 3 big parts. So they are the language situation and the missionaries' response, grammar writing activity, and finally the grammars as described. So the third one will be a little bit technical. So I don't blame you if you leave me on the third part of this lecture. Anyway, so these are the subtopics. Under the first part, which serves as the setting, we have the following topics: the linguistic panorama of the 16th century Philippines, origin of the lenguas generales, or the major languages as we know now, the missionary grammarians, and the grammars and vocabularies themselves, or the grammars that we studied. Second part, we take up the European intercolonial, European and intercolonial connections to show its ties with European linguistic activities. And next is the intended users of the grammars. We're going to look into their language training background, and then the meta-language to show the level of linguistics knowledge that the grammarians had at that time, and then the method of description. They use traditional grammar, but they use devices such as minimal pairs, which are concepts that are currently in use in modern linguistics, contrastive method, etc., to describe the linguistic categories. And with the third part, we have aesthetic appraisal of Tagalog, just to underscore the positive attitude of the grammarians, because it was such a big feat that if they're not motivated properly, I don't think it's going to get done. Geographical classification. So we're just going to see the spread, what kind of which languages of the Philippines were studied by the grammarians. Then the typological similarities, which happens to be the basis for using Tagalog as model, and one specific Tagalog grammar in particular as a kind of template. And then we go into the historical classification. We're just going to divide the grammars into two, the first period, second period grammar, spanning the 330 years of Spanish presence, more or less. And then finally, language analysis. We're going to describe a few grammatical elements, though we begin with a general description of the grammars themselves. Okay, so in terms of historiography, what do you call this? For the benefit of the students of history of linguistics, so the first two subtopics under the first part correspond to language structures and facts. And these are facts or clusters of facts relating to language structures and language situations in the past that have been the object of linguistic thought and description. So the last two subtopics under part one correspond to its epihistographhy, the agents and the material products, the missionary grammarians and the grammars and vocabularies that they created. The second part comprises the linguistic historiography itself, or the descriptive explanatory account of linguistic thought and description in the past. The last part is the linguistic thought and description itself, which includes all types of practices and conceptualizations dealing with analysis, regulation, comparison, historical, geographical, typological classification, and aesthetic appraisal of languages. So that's a lot, right? So we're about to see a sketch, like I said. Basically, it's a general view. It's like going to Vikings or Buffet 101. We can only choose a few items from the menu because what can we do? We only have one stomach, right? So in any case, this is one takeaway. I'm going to give it now just in case I lose you towards the end. An inescapable conclusion that one draws from this study is the fact that Philippine linguistics did not start without any prehistory. So it has its birthplace in Europe, and the developments that took place here were related to those happening in the West. Obviously with some delay, like once upon a time, films on DVD were delayed for 2 months or so, at least in Spain. I was there, and that was what I observed. However, since its material products are local and linguistic thought and description have been shaped by these facts and by the natives who acted as resource persons, we can consider this linguistics Philippine linguistics, albeit admittedly not exclusively so. So we go to the first part, 4 subparts: language situation and the response of our missionaries. So Dr. Abreras mentioned a little bit about this earlier. So this is the situation. The authors writing about the language situation of the Philippines seem to have reached a consensus that one salient characteristic of the Philippine linguistic landscape has been diversity. Okay, but a couple of decades after the start of stable colonization in 1965, major linguistic groups began to emerge. We know about that. Now, Phelan says, or cites a 1591 list of encomiendas and tributes, which shows the major linguistic groups in Luzon. So these are the ones, no? Round off numbers: Tagalog 124,000, Ilocano 75, Pangasinan 24, Pampanga 75, Bicol 77, Ibanag 96. Bisaya, no number was given, but okay, so it's there as actually the three. Now, Waray, Cebuano, and Hiligaynon, comprising a large single linguistic group. So more than 3 centuries later, based on the 1960 national census, and again in that year, in that of year 2000, we see the same languages, more or less. You notice that Ibanagas dropped out. Kapampangan is not in the census for reasons I don't know. But the fact is that these are the same languages that were seen, or linguistic groups that were seen 1591. So let's look into what happened at that time. So what the Spaniards had found when the first of them arrived in 1521 and again in 1565 was an ensemble of heterogeneous and dispersed communities who were frequently in disagreement and at war with one another. So Magellan would die in the hands of Lapu-Lapu, who was at war with the king of Cebu, to whom Magellan had wanted to show his courage, friendship, and loyalty. So in addition to such political fragmentation was a big social divide among nobles, freemen, and slaves, and a mix of so many ethnic groups. The diversity was so great that in 1780, Agustin Maria de Castro, this is what he said, put on record the need to use Spanish as a lingua franca, at least in the administration of the sacraments. Okay, so here's my free translation. This is the reason why, in my opinion, the confessional of Manila is the most difficult confessional to handle in the whole world, because since it is impossible to hear the confessions of all those people in their own languages, it is necessary to use Spanish, etc. Okay, so we move on to the next subpart, the origin of the major languages. So those 1591 figures cited by Phelan, I believe, was not the product, or were not the product of pure chance. No, some intervention would have put a process in motion which yielded that result. So to facilitate the administration of the islands and the evangelization of their inhabitants, the Spaniards would have to impose some order over such a chaotic situation. Specifically, a plan was designed and gradually implemented in which 3 major zones were its highlight, namely Manila and its vicinity, bigger provinces, and the settlements or pueblos. So these 3 facilitate the grouping of people's attention to their religious, educational, and public needs, collection of funds, organization of jobs, commerce, crops, etc., defense against enemies, and the simplification of the linguistic panorama, more importantly. So this event paved the way for the consolidation of the commonly spoken languages into major languages, which somehow simplified the linguistic landscape of the archipelago and systematized to a large extent the task of evangelization and colonization. So while admittedly this process did not directly or uniquely cause the creation of major languages, this social intervention resulted in the spread of these more commonly spoken languages because it gave them the necessary support to fulfill their function as a vehicle for common understanding. For example, in the province of Pangasinan, the autochthonous language was imposed as a common language for use by the different tribal groups living within the circumscription. The same happened with Tagalog, Ilocano, Pampanga, etc. in their respective provinces. So given the relative importance accorded to the major languages and the insufficient reason to learn Spanish, whose speakers were, we can say, limited to the Spanish authorities living in the capital, a civil or military administrator and his functionaries in the provinces, and in all cases, a missionary who evangelized the inhabitants. So the use of Spanish did not extend to the different language domains of the natives' social life. So the truth is that the environment did not provide enough support for bilingualism to take root and prosper, or to reduce the importance and eventually eliminate the native languages. It is therefore not surprising, at all, that the missionaries prepared for and carried out their task of evangelization by learning, studying, and codifying the languages. So 11 years after the foundation of the city of Manila, so Dr. Abrera mentioned it earlier, in 1571, the Synod of Manila was convoked by the bishop, the first bishop of the Philippines, Fray Domingo de Salazar, Dominican. It was an ecclesial event which would have important implications on the social life of the natives. So during the synod, there were two things that they agreed upon. The first one is that the archipelago belonged to the natives, and second, the gospel was going to be preached to them in their languages. So, however, the decision to use these native languages as the medium of evangelization did not always get the encouragement it needed from civil authorities. Why? Because there were laws to support the advocates of language learning or of language extermination. Okay, by imposing the use of Spanish, they seem to have been passed successively, without any misgivings about their implications. So, but while the civil governors vacillated in their choice of which language to support, the religious authorities, on the contrary, were of one mind in preaching the good news to the natives right in their very own tongues. So they therefore became bilinguals and became good instruments for the task that they were sent to the archipelago. So 1594, the archipelago was distributed among the four religious orders that had come from Spain. So we know this from our history. Augustinians and the Franciscans, being already well established in the islands before this year, received the biggest number of mission territories. The Augustinians received the provinces of Pampanga and Ilocos, and to the Franciscans were given Camarines. The Dominicans took charge of Pangasinan and Cagayan. The Jesuits shared the Visayan Islands with the Augustinians. Much later, the Augustinian Recollects also came and were given parishes scattered all over the archipelago. So this distribution or this partition not only eased the missionary burden of each of the religious groups, but also allowed them to focus on learning no more than 4 different languages. So it was a good thing that they did. So let's see what was happening in Europe at the time, just for us to see that, okay, so while there was linguistic activity happening in the archipelago, in the Philippines, okay, what was happening in Europe at the time? So Europe was in expansion mode. Columbus had landed in the American continent in 1492, opening the door to the encounter and learning of non-European languages by the Europeans. This coincided with the increase in appreciation and interest in the vernacular languages of Europe. And the first grammar of Spanish was published by Antonio de Nebrija, a very important person that we're going to see later during this lecture. The first grammar was published the same year that Columbus reached the Americas, 1492. And those of Italian and English came off the press in 1516 and 1586, respectively. Earlier in the year 1505, Pedro de Alcalá published the first European grammar of Arabic. Now, at this time, around this time, 15th century, Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in Europe helped diffuse knowledge and thus contributed to the spread of literacy all over the world by facilitating the mass production of books. So the colonization of the New World and the deployment of missionaries provided contact now between the Western world of linguistics and the new languages. The first grammar of an American Indian language was published in 1558. Meanwhile, a lot of linguistic activity was also taking place all over the world, not only in Europe or in the Philippines. There were also activities happening in China, Japan, India. 1786, the famous linguist Sir William Jones established the historical kinship of Sanskrit with Latin, Greek, and the Germanic languages. So the effect of this discovery would be felt in the next centuries. Not so far from home, now, in 1593, here in the Philippines, the Dominican friars established the first printing press in the archipelago. This was also the year when Doctrina Christiana, the first book printed in the Philippines, came out. So 1593. So look at the dates here on the slide. Compare this date, 1593, grammars, the dates of the grammar publication of these languages. Not so far. By the next century, there were 4 printing presses in the country that published about 100 bilingual catechisms, dictionaries, grammars, and guides for confession. Okay, so let's talk about the missionary grammarians. Let's consider the main protagonists or the agents in this grammar writing activity. So Blancas de San Jose is the author of the earliest Tagalog, Francisco Blancas de San Jose, author of the earliest Tagalog grammar to have been printed. I'm sure you know that there were Tagalog grammars that came out before 1610, the year of publication of Blancas de San Jose, but okay, so we don't have extant copies of those. So he was a Dominican friar from Saragossa, Spain. Meanwhile, Francisco Coronel, the author of our Pampango grammar, or one of the two that we considered in this study, Francisco Lopez, who wrote Ilocano grammar, Alonso Mentrida, who wrote Hiligaynon grammar, they were all Augustinians, and like Blancas de San Jose, Francisco Blancas de San Jose, they were all born in Spain. So Guadalajara, Alcalá de Henares, and Toledo, respectively. So this and the other missionary grammarians were inheritors, now I can say, of a rich linguistic legacy, which had originated in ancient Greece and Rome, the Greco-Roman grammar, right, traditional grammar, and successively handed down through the generations of language scholars. So this fact is evident in the constant references they make to the classical linguistic categories and terminology. Okay, so these were the grammars that we studied in preparation for this lecture many years ago. The authors of the grammars we have studied were all from Spain and belonged to the Dominican Augustinian and Franciscan religious orders. So in addition to, you'll see on the table that in addition to the pastoral assignments they also discharged other important ecclesiastical functions and or endowed with special talents and qualification. One of them was an architect, I forgot who, and built churches. So when Christian missionary work started in and from Europe in the Middle Ages, at the time when monasteries and churches were being built in foreign lands, a greater need for teaching Latin emerged. During the Renaissance, when the revival of classical languages was in vogue, students were initiated into the study of Latin authors by means of textbooks in grammar such as Antonio de Nebrija's Introducciones Latinae, which is actually a very important Latin grammar book that later on we'll see how important it is. So by a royal decree in 1598, around the time that the colonization was happening here, it had been made the official Latin grammatical system in all Spanish territories. So in Spain, the study of languages of Latin particularly had not been interrupted since the time of the Romans. Latin was part of the liberal arts, which everyone who wished to study the sciences must learn. The greater part of these studies was carried out within the cloisters of religious orders, which had a long tradition of linguistic study or language learning. So from our vantage point, it is crystal clear that the native languages would be propagated, but it was not as clear at the time. At the start, there was no discussion about Hispanization or Castilianization, but since evangelization was of utmost an urgent concern for Charles I and later Philip II, language became a big issue because the missionaries needed a language that they could use to preach the gospel and be understood by the natives. As mentioned, the civil authorities did not hesitate to successfully defend the supporters of language learning and of termination by imposing the use of their languages. Well, this situation, ambiguous situation, lasted until the 18th century. So at the height of the conflict, The highest civil authorities in the archipelago were excommunicated, and the religious order's departure order to go to the missions was canceled. As a consequence of the conflict, there was a general decline in grammatical production in the second half of the 17th century, and gaps had to be filled in the first half of the 18th century. We'll see that later in the periodization that I am going to show you. Very often, the civil lawmakers had the upper hand, obviously, despite the missionaries' continued lobbying for support and legislative backing for the mission. But the prolific production of grammars and dictionaries in the 19th century shows the real winners in this linguistic contest. Now, amidst this conflicting interest, one can see in the specific works themselves and in the amount of linguistic production that the only objective in the minds of the missionaries was the pastoral intention. That is, salus animarum, the salvation of souls. And this is the reason why any disputes that might occur among grammarians and lexicographers were never given any great importance. An author, a Spanish author, in 2002, by the name of Suero, cites Totanes, one of the grammarians who wrote a Tagalog grammar. We did not include his work here. Speaking about the irrelevance of differing opinions vis-a-vis the missionaries' divine undertaking, said this, no? This is the translation of what he said. This Tagalog language, as some may say, is rich only in superfluity, scarce and poor in what is necessary, with very little finesse and devoid of any elegance. Granted that it be so, although many others, experts in this language, feel quite the contrary, the goal to which the study is directed is most divine, and thus divinizes this language for being a necessary means to acquire that end, be it Tagalog or another. The reason for which it is studied is the highest and holiest of all ends. But whatever the motives and whichever sectors held them, and those motives, the quantity of works reprinted, written, and published in the 19th century speaks very eloquently of the patronage the Spaniards afforded to the native languages. This great interest on the part of civil society to learn the languages of the islands can be explained by two specific historical events. So the first one is that there was an intense commercial exchange between Spain, the peninsula, and the Philippines, the archipelago, until 1898. And the fact that the use of Spanish never extended to the archipelago as it did in the American colonies. All right, so we move on. Let's now have a look at the material products of the Spanish colonial period. So just look at the numbers. Based on bibliographical and other sources, a total of 125 grammars and 109 vocabulary works, extant and lost, were written from the beginning of stable Spanish presence in the archipelago until the end of the 19th century. So in comparison, there were only 104 grammars and 108 vocabularies of the Amerindian languages in the American colonies attested in the literature. So accordingly, while 12% of Philippine languages, 15 out of about 130 were studied, only 4% of the Amerindian languages, 32 of more than 800, were covered by the missionaries who went to the Americas. So obviously the strategies they followed were different from each other. So the basis of this lecture is our study of the following 11 representative grammars. All the major languages are represented, including Ibanag. So the next slide shows a table that describes each of these grammars, but we're going to go through this very quickly since I think we're eating up a lot of time and we're just in the introduction. Okay, so these are the 10 authors. Look at the first publication, their first publication. So this spans the period 1610 up to the dawn of the 20th century, 1904. So earliest Tagalog grammar to have been printed, Blancas de San Jose. And then earliest extant grammar of Pampango by Coronel. The first printed grammar of Ilocana were edited in 1895 by Lopez, etc. So these were the 11 grammars that we looked into. Okay, we're now in part 2. Thanks be to God. I think we're going to finish. All right, so the grammar writing activity itself. So we have said earlier that we can refer to Philippine linguistics. We can refer to it as Philippine linguistics, and that it has its origins in Europe. Now, in part 2, we shall situate ourselves at the time the missionaries were writing the grammar. So looking into the rich linguistic background they had, the grammatical model and tradition they shared, and the method they had used in the actual description of our native languages. Again, so we're going deeper into it. It's not very technical yet. The third part will be technical, I assure you. Sorry about that. All right, so let's look into their intercolonial connections, meaning Philippines and then Mexico, Americas. European and intercolonial connections. The Spanish missionaries had learned Latin and Spanish in the peninsula, so presumably with the use of the grammar of Antonio de Nebrija, the one that we mentioned earlier, Introducciones Latine. So with this prior knowledge of formal grammar and a method developed from the experience of writing grammars and dictionaries of Hebrew and Aramaic from as early as the 10th century in Spain, and of learning Latin since the time of the Romans, they undertook the study, description, and teaching of the new languages they found in the Philippines. So there are 3 important persons to mention here. So I mentioned one already, that's Antonio de Nebrija. Second is Alonso de Molina, and then Lorenzo Herbas y Panduro. So this is the first one, Antonio de Nebrija, 1441 to 1522, author of the first Spanish grammar and the first Spanish dictionary. His Spanish grammar is the first published grammar study of any modern European language. It's a widely accepted opinion that the missionaries, both in the Americas and in our archipelago, wrote grammars of exotic languages. When they did that, they used the works of Nebrija, okay, in mind, especially his Instituciones. That grammar book was republished or reprinted with a different title, Instituciones, but it's still the Introducciones Latine. So it was the model. Then we have Alonso de Molina, Spanish Franciscan priest and grammarian. He wrote a well-known vocabulario of the Nahuatl language, Mexico, published in 1571. So there's an excerpt here I'm going to show you, an excerpt from his vocabulario, which provides evidence that the missionaries actually knew the Latin grammar of Nebrija. I'm talking about missionaries sent to Mexico and the Philippines, because as we know, most, if not all, of the missionaries who came to the Philippines passed through Mexico first. Okay, so the first religious missionaries who arrived in the islands on Feb 13, 1565, especially the Franciscans, knew Alonso de Molina's work and methodology. One of them was Father Juan de Ayora, okay, familiar name, died in 1581. He's considered as the apostle of Ilocos and author of Arte y Diccionario de la Lengua Iloca de Filipinas. He was a student of, Father or Alonso de Molina. Effectively, the link between Nebrija and the first linguistic works on Philippine languages were Father Alonso de Molina. Alonso de Molina. Practically all the religious who went, like I said, to the archipelago stayed in Mexico for some months, and that enabled them to appreciate the kind of work done by their fellow missionaries, especially in the field of translation and interpretation. So the knowledge of Molina of Nebrija's works is seen in the following textual evidence now provided by our Spanish author Joaquin Suero. So I made this translation. So all the verbs of the language will be rendered in the first person present indicative if they have it, or in the third person since all verbs have it, or it has always the same form for the singular and plural. The equivalent in the Romance language, however, will be in the infinitive form, as actually Antonio de Nebrija does it in his vocabulary. Sorry, I deleted that by accident. Yeah. Then we have Lorenzo Herbas y Panduro, Spanish Jesuit who went to the Americas as a missionary until 1767. So his work, his greatest work is the huge treatise on cosmography, Idea del Universo, Italian, which includes the results of his attempts to investigate the origin and ethnological relationship of different nations on the basis of language. His linguistic works constitute one of the greatest contributions of the Age of Enlightenment to the study of language and languages for two reasons. So first is, in his works, he deals with all the themes of theoretical linguistics current among the 18th century scholars, and he comes up with one of the most detailed descriptions of the languages of the world at the time, including Philippine languages, and succeeds in establishing genetic relations or affinity and grouping them into families. Okay, so we move on. The meta language that they use. So their formal knowledge, I mean, the missionaries, formal knowledge of Latin and Spanish grammars provided them with a meta language with which they could speak about the new languages that they encountered in their respective assignments. So both missionary grammarians and the missionary language learners use this knowledge as a handle in teaching and learning the languages. So the grammarians always had to recall the Spanish and or Latin equivalent as they discuss the different parts of speech and their usage. Now, how about the method of description? So we can now have a glimpse into the content of their meta language as well as the grammatical model provided by their reference languages, so Castilian, Spanish, and Latin. We're going to go through this fast. There's an outline to guide us. 5 parts: the Greco-Roman grammatical system, the Brias Latin and Spanish grammars, the use of minimal pairs, which was groundbreaking at the time, and then the direct method of learning the living languages and the contrastive method of writing the grammars. We shall have a cursory look at the Greco-Roman grammatical system as shown in Nebrija's Latin and Spanish grammars, like the definition and parts or division of grammar, parts of speech, we'll just zero in on nouns and verbs, but quickly, and their concept of the phoneme at that time. Afterwards, we shall see how they used what in the 20th century would be called minimal pairs. Then we'll talk about the direct method that they use in learning the languages and the contrastive method, like I said, in writing the grammar. So what they had was what we know as traditional grammar. Nowadays, the approach, however, was more descriptive than prescriptive. We know traditional grammar as a prescriptive grammar, right? But they were more descriptive than prescriptive. So the prescriptive part comes to light when the grammarians instruct the learners, fellow missionaries, to refer not to classic authors as the grammars of that time would do, but to the usage by the natives, being the best models of these languages. Aware that the native languages shared common characteristics with Latin and Spanish, they also knew that there would be many differences. In addition to traditional methods and concepts, they use novel ideas such as, like I said, the minimal pairs, the direct method, the contrastive method, to describe linguistic categories and elements heretofore unknown to them. Now, there's this author, Antonio Quiles. In 1980, he prepared an edition of Nebrija's Gramática de la Lengua Castellana, in which both the introducciones and the gramática are tackled. So we'll have a quick look at the important points to give us a concrete idea of the meta language and the reference languages in question. The reference languages would be Latin and Spanish. At the same time, the meta language. So these are the definitions given by Nebrija. Nebrija considers grammar as the foundation of all knowledge and as guide to the truth. So in Grammatica, the grammar is the art of letters, while in Introducciones, it is defined as the science of correct speaking and correct writing based on the use of the wisest of men, the authorities, and of the collective authority. So this is the first division. Following Quintilian, that's about 35 to 100 AD. The first division is between the methodical or doctrinal part, which contains the precepts and rules, and the historical part, which includes the poets and the other authors worthy of emulation. The methodical part, is subdivided according to the manner of classic medieval division. So you have these four: orthography, the science of good and correct writing; prosody is basically accent, and it includes all the method of counting, weighing, and measuring the metric feet of verses and couplets. So you see that also actually, you look at the grammars that are present here, meaning to say the ones written by the missionaries, you see all this. And then etymology, or the truth of words, which treats the meaning and characteristics of each of the parts of speech. And finally, syntax, also known to Latin grammarians as construction, and can be called order since it deals with the sequencing and parts of a sentence. Okay, so Nebrija's Latin grammar enumerates 8 parts of speech. I think in English there are also 8, right? But somewhere in the grammar, he adds the gerund and the supine. On the other hand, the Spanish grammar has 10 parts of speech. Noun, pronoun. I mean to say, it's different. No? Maybe the categories or the basis for categorizing the parts of speech is different in Latin and in Spanish by the same author, Nebrija. We shall look into the treatment of nouns and verbs now in the meta language and reference languages, because the same treatment, same terminology, and even examples were used by the grammarians we are currently considering in this talk, in this lecture. Actually, the same can be said of the other parts of speech. So here's the noun, for example. Nouns are defined as one of the 10 parts of speech, declined in terms of cases, does not have tense, and it means body or thing. So here you see that nouns have 6 accidents. Actually, the only 2 are shown in this slide, now quality and species. The next slide will show the rest now: figure, gender, number, and case declension. Important thing here is to simply familiarize ourselves with this term, since they make up the terminology used in the grammars. Okay, so we go to the next slide. And the rest of the accidents are here: figure, the difference between simple and compound / composite; gender, number, cases. Okay. Okay, so an example, declension of hombre, according to the 5 cases in Spanish. So we also see this. Okay, I have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cases on the first column. Then the example itself, look at the vocative, oh hombre, and hey man. So that's the declension of hombre according to the 5 cases in Spanish. We also see this way of declining nouns in our grammars. Particularly amusing is really the vocative. In Tagalog, it's ay Pedro. Look at this. Okay, this is from Blancas de San Jose. According to 6 cases, Blancas de San Jose added the ablative, the object of the preposition. So for our grammarians, as you will see later, we'll have time for that. Nouns are non-variable, doesn't change, do not change in terms of form, in such a way that the same form is used for both singular and plural. And for all cases, a change in case is seen through the different markers, which the grammarians call preposiciones. So in English, we call them, we can call them markers. So here are the markers, no? Si Pedro, ni Pedro, kay Pedro, etc. Now, of course, the vocative also would have where's the vocative? There. Ay Pedro. Okay, and then, the verb, the Nebrija adopts the grammarian Frisian, Roman. His definition and accidents of verbs. So the verb is one of 10 parts of speech, declined by moods and tenses, not by cases. And there are 8 accidents. So here you have species, figure, genus, and mood. On the next slide, you see the rest. There's tense, number, person, conjugation, and voice. Sorry. Right, so the concept of the phoneme. So phoneme is actually a 19th century creation, but they have this. So it was obviously unknown to the grammarians during Nebria's time, but they had a clear idea of what phonetic units are. So Nebria proposes the concept of indivisibility and finiteness of phonetic elements, as we see illustrated in a sentence that Killis, the one who put together the Latin and Spanish grammars of Nebria in one book. So he says the following: que la letra es la menor parte. The translation is right below. The letter is the smallest part of the spoken word that can be written. If I say señor, this word is divided into 2 syllables, which are se and ñor. Then se is divided into s and e, but the s can no longer be split. So it's indivisible. And these phonetic units have to be rendered in writing by representing, to the extent possible, one sound with a single letter. So this is the origin of the long tradition of Spanish spelling system, which is eminently phonological. So hence, Nebria's formula is expressed as follows. Now, we have to write as we speak and speak as we write, which is not original to him, but something that has already been defended in Rome by Quintilian, or his compatriot from the Roman province of Hispania. I think this is locally, that's what we refer to as kung ano ang bigkas siyang baybay, o kung siyang baybay siyang bigkas. Okay, now we're talking about the Greco-Roman grammar, right? So, well, the Greek grammarians distinguish between the written letter, the gramma, and the sound, stoichion. The Roman tradition does not make any distinction, and thus the two different concepts of graphic sign and phonetic sign converge in one word, the letter. And that's where the frequent confusion of phonetic students lies. You'll see that also in the grammars. All right, so use of minimal pairs. Again, this is a breakthrough because the minimal pairs is a recent invention. I mean, the idea. Now, Blancas de San Jose dedicates the 4th rule of the last chapter to Tagalog pronunciation. So he gives instructions on how to articulate difficult sounds, how stress can change meanings, and how some vowels can be interchanged. For this, the recourse to minimal pairs and sets has been a very important tool. In some cases, the sounds include those that do not occur in Spanish or Latin. So let's see this. Okay, so that's a screenshot I got from the book. Well, it's a digital copy. He says that this language contains a big number of words that pronounce the H sound, without which those words would mean differently. So he gives a long list of minimal pairs. Example, hirap. The translation here is trabajo or work. Hirap, as compared to irap, mirar con mal ojo, to look at someone with a condescending eye. And then kabatahan, sufrimiento, suffering. Kabataan, ninyaria, childishness. Ubo, hubo. Actually, it's not perfect because, okay, so they're foreigners, right? So, but the truth is that they have a concept of the minimal pairs, the minimal sets. So this is an example from the Ilocano grammar of Lopez. We see that the letters are treated as phonetico-orthographic symbols. So they also represent linguistic sounds. So he says, the alphabet can be considered under 2 different aspects. That is, phonetically, as a set of sounds peculiar to a language, and graphically as a set of written signs and figures by which the sounds are are expressed. This is from the Ilocano grammar, but edited in 1895, updated. Then the direct method of learning the languages. Well, Francisco Blancas, this is very important. So, so we really have to continue quoting him or referring to him. He proposes direct contact with the speakers of the language as a method of language learning. So it's not only through the grammars that they learned. Obviously, they had to consult the experts. No? Those are the natives, the native speakers. So he gives instructions and orientations to the language learners in the preliminary pages, the first pages of his work. He advocates direct and continuous contact with the native speakers to verify what is learned through the grammar book. Now, in many cases, Blancas de San Jose advises the language learner to defer to or to refer to the native, especially in matters concerning usage and pronunciation. For instance, after explaining the difference between two words of the same graphic form, same spelling, but whose accented syllables are different, he says, it's here on the slide, if by this it is not understood, may those who are keen on learning the language ask the native speakers, and they will see the difference if they have a good ear. So in another instance, on declaring that the paka plus root construction does not seem to allow tense variation, that is, no present, no future, or even an imperative form, he says that asking about the imperative, I did not find any consensus among the doctors of the language, of course, obviously referring to the native speakers. This is the contrastive method. So the Spanish grammarians approached the native languages through the contrastive method. It consisted in these steps. Now, in using their knowledge of Spanish and Latin grammars as the starting point of any analysis and description. So direct equivalents of the linguistic devices and mechanisms found in Spanish and Latin were sought, and when there were no direct counterparts, substitutes were found. And thus, we observe the frequent appeal to the process of substitution or suppletion, especially as regards the Spanish and Latin verb tenses. The substantive verb to be, no? In Latin, sum es fui, or ser in Spanish. The oblique cases, no? Genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, etc. And even the distinctive sounds of the object languages. When there are mechanisms in the languages that do not exist in either Spanish or Latin, the grammarians embark on their description by using the classical categories and terminology, but clearly pointing out the novelty of the phenomenon, as in the case of the facere verbs. Now, we're using ecclesiastical Latin here, because these are missionaries. Not classical. So facere verbs, we'll see that later. The improper passives of ibanag, which ironically represent the normal passive voice in Philippine languages. The unusual uses of the articles, as in the associate, what they call the associative plural, exemplified by the phrase sina Pedro. Pedro is su compañía o casa. Peter and his companions or household, or the use of proper noun articles for common nouns. For example, si Bapa, mi padre, my father, or si Ali, mi tía, my aunt. Sina Bapa, mi padre y su compañía, my father and his companions. The glottal stop and the so-called he gangosa, or the velar nasal ng. So in many cases, the grammarians had to use the Latin or Spanish categories that they learned from Antonio de Nebrija, and they apply them in describing these unique features. For example, the focus of a sentence was described in terms of which noun takes the nominative case in a passive sentence. The different verbal aspects and modes were couched in terms of the traditional verb tenses and moods, like the indicative, subjunctive, and imperative. So we also see that at times the discovery of new categories which did not exist in the reference languages was was accompanied by the invention of new labels. Now, for example, what we said earlier, now the facere, or the later development is facere fieri, the hegangosa, referring to the velar nasal sound, but sometimes not, such as the, but sometimes not. I mean, sometimes they did not invent new terms, such as the glottostop that Blancas de San Jose described as follows. No, sorry, it's not here. Okay, so this is the last part, and we still have time. Very good. So the last part, the grammars as described. So like I promised, this is going to be very technical, but I'm sure you're going to be with me. All right. So there are 5 subparts here. You have the aesthetic appraisal of Tagalog, the geographical classification, the spread, no? Typological similarities, the historical classification, and language analysis. We shall talk about this now. Okay, first, the missionaries, both the teachers and the intended users of the grammars, they knew exactly what they were going to teach or learn, which were the native languages, and then they knew the reason why they were going to embark on this undertaking, and they knew what the method would be. In other words, in terms of attitude towards the task of learning, of codifying in the first place, they were completely sold on the idea. So in many cases, they expressed their admiration for the languages that they were studying, some kind of an apologia for the undertaking that they had freely chosen. So here's a quote from Francisco Colin. Was a Jesuit historian and educator. He compares Tagalog with the 4 greatest languages of the world. So here's my translation. Without any doubt, Tagalog is more noble, solemn, artful, and elegant because it shares 4 qualities with the 4 best languages of the world, namely Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Spanish. From Hebrew, aside from the similarity already mentioned in the use of its vowels and consonants, Tagalog has the roots of the words, their fecundity and mystery, and the gutturals. From Greek, the articles and the declension of nouns, and in the conjugations, the plurality of forms and tenses. From Latin, beauty and elegance. And from Spanish, the good upbringing, finesse, and courtesy. So that's Francisco Colin. Now, the pastoral end ultimately was the reason why disputes that might occur among the grammarians and lexicographers, those who compile the words, the word lists, were never given any great importance. So again, our author, Joaquin Sueiro, cites Sototanes, speaking about the irrelevance of opposing opinions about the beauty of Tagalog vis-a-vis the missionaries' noble purpose. So let's look at my translation. This Tagalog language, as some may say, is rich only in superfluity, scarce and poor in what is necessary, with very little finesse and devoid of any elegance. Granted that it be so, although many others, experts in this language, feel quite the contrary, the goal to which the study is directed is most divine, and thus divinizes this language for being a necessary means to acquire that end, be it Tagalog or another, the reason for which it is studied is the highest and holiest of all ends. I think I read this out earlier. Sorry about that. Okay, so geographical classification. Well, it is simple. So remember that there was a division, right, of the archipelago into contiguous areas among the 4 religious orders, Augustinians, the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits. It was motivated by the dearth of missionaries, and as ordered by King Philip II, it yielded the following distribution. So Augustinians learned Tagalog, Pampango, Ilocano, and Bisaya. Dominicans, Tagalog, Ibanag, Pangasinan, and Bisaya. Franciscans, Tagalog, Bisaya, Bicol. Jesuits, Tagalog, and Bisaya. You see that in all cases, Tagalog is present. Now, from the 1590s to 1800, only these languages were learned, documented, and taught. After 1800, grammars of Maguindanao, Panay, and Tiruray were also written. Okay, typological similarities. They knew that The Philippine languages had common properties, and so they found it very convenient to adapt descriptions of other Philippine languages made by other missionary linguists, whether from the same religious order or not. So they would share their grammatical descriptions. In other words, they made use of templates. Now, I said earlier that Blancas de Sones's grammar is very important. This is it. No? They used the Blancas de San Jose's grammar as template, being the first one, first published, and it effectively elevated the grammar to the status of a model, at least until the 18th century, because after that, another model came out by other grammarians, both Tagalog and other Philippine languages. Not only the Tagalog grammarians who used him as template or who use his grammar as template, but also those others studying other non-Tagalog languages of the Philippines. The grammarians, beginning from Blancas de San Jose, ordinarily acknowledge their indebtedness. So you can see where they copy from to the other grammarians. Now, Berganio, for example, admitted having used the grammars of Tagalog, Ilocano, and Pangasinan as his references. And also the Pampango grammar of Coronel, the much later Pampango grammar, also did the same. Aparicio disclosed the references he used in modernizing the grammar of Mentrida, the Iligaynon grammar that we studied. Then, of course, they were conscious of these similarities. Herbas y Panduro these ideas about the genetic affinity of the languages must have consolidated the missionaries' growing consciousness that these languages form part of a single family and therefore have strong typological similarities. So occasionally the grammarians were more explicit now in saying that these languages were related to each other. For instance, the section on syntax of the Ilocano grammar declares the following in its prefatory notes. And esta lengua Ilocana, so in this Ilocano language, is what happens in all the languages of these Philippine islands on account of their belonging to the same type. One saves a big part of the work that one does in learning the Latin languages. And then we have Diego Berganio, author of the first Pampango grammar. Sorry, the second. He had this to say in his introduction to the affix pa, where he states that the facere verb can be found in the other native languages. So he says, this famous or esta famosa composición, this famous construction, I judge, not without strong basis, transcends linguistic boundaries and is found in the neighboring languages. This also explains why there are repetitive chapters and sections, not only in terms of titles, but more significantly, contents. Now, for example, the search for the substitutes for the substantive verb, the sum est fui, the verb to be, the Latin verses that state the usage of the three types of passive verbs. We'll see that later. The facere, and many others. Okay, now this is the historical classification. We have used three authors now, put them together, and then fit all the grammars that we have found. So first is three people: Ernesto Constantino, our very own. Then that Spanish author that I have been quoting, Joaquin Suero, and then John Ledi Fellan. Everybody knows him. So Constantino in 1970 said that studies on Philippine languages can be divided into three areas now: Spanish, 1521 to 1898, American, 1898-1945, and the period of independence, 1946 onwards. Okay, so Spanish is 1521 to 1898. Then we have Suero stating that all Spain's territory, we're not just talking about the Philippines now, we're talking about the Americas as well. One can establish two periods. First period is the discovery, exploration, and conquest and settlement. That's from the 16th to the 18th centuries. And second is the colonial stability or stable coexistence, 19th century. The first period has two phases. Now, phase one is in the Philippines, starts with Magellan's landing in Leyte, characterized by the use of sign languages and gestures and the employment of interpreters. So we know that there was a slave by the name of Henry, no, who knew Malay, which was the lingua franca in the area until the 16th century, and who could serve as an interpreter. So naturally, Enrique needed a speaker of the Malayan language, Bahasa Malaysia, Malaya, who also knew the language of the natives. So there was a double interpretation or double translation. Then phase two began with the official foundation of Manila, 1971. By this time, a certain amount of organization in the administration of the islands had been established. So remember the intervention that resulted in the consolidation of the languages. Here it is. The natives had been grouped into settlements, although their separation from the Spaniards was still considerable. Given this separation, which meant very little exposure of the natives to the Spanish language, it's not surprising that the missionaries started to learn, study, and codify the languages. Okay, and these are the subdivisions of phase two. 4, no? Yeah, the inauspicious start of linguistic studies is according to John Leddy-Phelan. Primer period linguistic studies, 1593-1648. A general decline, second half of the 17th century, and filling up the gaps of the first half of the 18th century. So this period encompasses the first 200 years since the arrival of Magellan, 1521, because remember that the Spanish crowns changed their dispositions regarding the use of the native languages vis-a-vis that of Castilian, and the protracted tug-of-war between the proponents of Hispanization and those who advocated the use of the native languages for evangelization. So here's a schema, a visual representation of the historical periodization of the grammar. So the colored ones are what we're talking about. I mean, the grammars fall under these categories. Okay. So the following representative grammars originally written in the 17th and 18th centuries belong to the first period. Now you have the grammars of Tagalog, the two grammars of Pampango, the Ilocano grammar, and then Bisaya, Cebuano. So the three of these were revised or reprinted in the 19th century up to the early 20th century. Okay, so those ones colored in pink. So among these grammars, those of Tagalog and Pampango can be considered the best reference materials for identifying the distinguishing characteristics of the grammars that belong to the first period, given that these grammars were never substantially modified when they were reprinted. So many of their features can be seen preserved in those published in this period, but were revised and reprinted in the 19th century, especially in the Hiligaynon grammar. So in the re-edited grammars of Hiligaynon, Ilocano, and Cebuano, we can see elements that span. Wait a second. So there's a message. Okay, so 10. Oh yeah, we have 10 minutes so that we can have time for. So which means to say that we're going to do some magic. No, we're going to skip some parts, right? Okay, so these grammars of these were the grammars of the first period. Second period, okay, it's all different now because language teaching is already incorporated in the curriculum. And then at this time also, learners other than missionaries were studying the languages. Okay, so these were the grammars that belong to the second period: Pangasinan, Ibanag, Waray, Tagalog, and Bicol. These are just representative grammars. No? They're not all the grammars that we have. So language analysis. This is the last part, but we have 10 minutes to cover this. But I'll just show you the entire thing. Internal structure, parts of speech, pronunciation. It's long, so we really have to do some trimming. So internal structure of the grammars. Okay, so in the first part, there were Okay, they had their own way of structuring the grammar, but eventually, towards the 19th century, they were following the prescriptions of the Spanish Academy, Language Academy. Okay, we can skip this. The intended users, like I said, diversified. It's not only just the missionaries, but also civilians and military personnel would be coming to join the government. Okay, so we can skip this. So this is actually the parts of the grammar of Blancas de San Jose. Just two parts, na Arte Tagala and the Libro de las Reglas, and that's repeated in the grammars of the first period. Now, grammars, the standard lessons are this. Okay, the usual things, the one that we saw earlier when we looked into the what do you call this, the grammar of Latin and Spanish. We can skip this. Okay, so those three grammars, Lopez, grammar of Ilocano, Encina's grammar of Cebuano, and Coria's grammar of Tagalog, they were following the Royal Spanish Academy's prescriptions as regards grammars. Okay, so we can skip this. We have seen that earlier. Okay, so these are actually, what I'm showing you are the unique. What I'm showing you are the unique features that the grammarians have seen as they codified, as they describe the languages. So we're saying that even if they were using traditional grammar, Latin and Spanish being the reference languages, we're saying that they were able to describe, they were able to sense in the first place unique properties of the Philippine languages. Sum es fui, they realized that in Tagalog there's no verb to be, no. And then Blancas de San, if you look at this example, even said correctly that the ay is actually an inversion signal. No? It's not the verb to be. Okay, so Coronel and the others looked for the equivalent of sum es fui in their respective languages. Then you have the active and passive verbs, which actually make up most of the grammar. So there's no separate part on syntax, but there's a proliferation of lessons. There's a proliferation of lessons on how to compose or how to construct active and passive verbs. So what's interesting here? So this is from Waray. So they were able to extract the affixes, okay, that are attached to roots, and but in doing so, they're able to form new meanings. Okay, we can skip this. We said that there's already the nascent dichotomy between active and passive verbs, and what's interesting is that the passive verbs are described in terms of Latin verses. So there are 3 Latin verses here that the grammarians throughout those two periods used, and adapting these Latin verses according to the language that they were using. Okay, this is the facere. In Latin means to make or do. This is actually our causative verb. Make somebody do something without using the word command. For example, magpasulat. Magpasulat ka ng kwento. So this is the explanation from Berganyo and from Blancas de San Jose. Pronunciation, we just said earlier that they were already using the what do you call this? The minimal pairs. They have a concept of the phoneme, and then but at the same time, this quotation is about going to the experts, the natives, in order to compare their pronunciation with the authorities. Yeah, so they describe the sounds, no? Consonants and vowels using traditional grammar. But like I said, okay, it's not that they imposed the pronunciation or the sounds found in the reference languages, but they're able to capture, you know, what was truly native. This is, well, not funny, but this is what their perception. Hiligay nun. The author says there are 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, which are reduced to 3 because A and E are used indistinguishably or interchangeably in general, although in some places they use the E more than the E, and in others vice versa. And then the same thing with the O and U, also interchangeable. Okay, syntax. This is the last part. Thanks be to God. So syntax, like I said, there's no separate section on syntax, especially the first grammars. Now, those belong to the first period, but the second period, there's already that because, like we said, they were already using prescriptions of the Spanish Language Academy. Okay. Okay, this is, I think, second to the last slide. 3 takeaways. First, as mentioned earlier, Philippine linguistics during the Spanish colonial period took its origins from Western linguistics by way of the Spanish grammarian, and its development ran parallel to that of Western linguistics. Second, by the flexible application of traditional grammar, the grammarians described not only features that are common to Latin and Spanish, but also those that are unique to the native languages. And third, while Tagalog served as a third reference language, its grammar was not superimposed on other languages. Thank you very much. That's what we tried to what we tried to cover in an hour and a half. Really sorry that I have had to run in the last part. I hope you got what I said. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sir Arwin. I hope you learned a lot today. May quiz po tayo mamaya. Okay, so some that we have learned today from this lecture, yung linguistic panorama at the time of contact with the Spaniards, the work of the missionary grammarians, and the field of what we call missionary linguistics. The description of the languages in the grammar books, medyo na madali lang to yung last part, and how some of the modern concepts we know today had already been applied centuries ago, albeit without the current terminology, and how this works fit in the grand narrative of the beginnings of linguistics from the Greco-Roman tradition up to the present. So, ayun. So the links of Nebrija, sino yun? Alonso de Molina, Hervas Epanduro, all of those are our connection to the grand tradition. The great traditional grammar or classical tradition. Okay. Yeah. Before we proceed to questions, you would like to acknowledge our participants today who are from all over the country, who are representing their provinces. Well, so there are some from various areas in Metro Manila, from Rizal, Bulacan, Pampanga, from Abra, Isabela, Ilocos Sur, and Palawan. From Visayas, we have Negros Oriental and Cebu, and also have some from Davao and Zamboanga. Okay. Meron pa ba? Ay, hindi ko natawag Batangas. Okay. Okay. Yun, Batangas. Sige. There's a question here from Sir Benito San Victores. Yung Tagalog po ba ay Tagalog ng Maynila o lalawigang isa sa mga lalawigan ng Calabarzon? So ano po yung variety, sir, na ginamit among those studies?
Okay, there were 2, right? The first one by Blancas de San Jose actually moved from one place to another. So I think in the end it was Southern Tagalog with a mix of Bataan. It's written in the prefatory remarks, but right now I just don't remember exactly which Tagalog variety he used. So because they knew that there were, I should have shown some slides about their recognition of the dialects of the languages that they studied. But okay, so too bad I didn't get that opportunity. So that one. So it's not just one Tagalog variety that was used in order to come up with that Blancas de Jose grammar. It's a combination of, I think, two. And yes, because these missionaries would move from one place to another at times. So that's the benefit of that guy. And then the other one, the one of Korea, also the same thing happened. But I think he was assigned in the south, Laguna area. I mean, southern Manila, right? And that one was special in the sense that it was presented in Madrid, because at that time there was a professorial lecture, professorial chair for Tagalog in the one of the first universities in Spain. It's Central, I think. Universidad Central de Madrid. I don't know what the name of that university is at this point.
Okay, a question from Rona Repangkol from the UP Archaeological Studies program. So, sir, what do you think are the factors that contributed to the Spanish missionary success in dissecting our native languages in order to create publications on grammar? And have these grammar books been developed for use in the context of the recent times?
Okay, so wait a second. So I didn't get all the questions. Okay, so the first question is okay, what contributed to the success?
Yes, success
okay.
of dissecting our native languages.
And then the next question
the second, have these grammar books been developed for use in the context of the recent times?
Okay, very good. Okay, so what contributed? Okay, of course, their missionary intention, the missionary purpose. They were really driven. Now, if you look at the preface, the first pages of each of the grammars, you'll see that they were really excited about it, and they talked about the relationship of their activity, that grammatical activity, with what they were doing in the archipelago, which is missionary. And then what else? Then I think the natural method of learning languages contributed a lot, which is to consult the natives. There were some names mentioned in the grammars, not only in Tagalog. Of course, we know that there was Tomas Pintin of Bataan, right? And then okay. So now I recall, the Blancas de San Jose Tagalogas also has a Bataan Tagalog. No? Okay, and then where was I? So the missionary end or purpose of their activity. Second is the natural method of learning the languages, which means to say that they would go to the natives in order to compare. Okay, is my pronunciation correct? Although, of course, we know that. I mean, there are still Spanish missionaries in the country, right? And when you hear them talk in Tagalog or in the native language, you realize that so there are sounds that they can't pronounce because of the interference from the native language, which is Spanish. Okay, so the second question is about whether these grammars have been used in order to develop textbooks the ones that we're using right now. Okay, so what I can say is that there's a continuity between the Spanish colonial period, which ended 1898, and the grammar and the periods that followed, American period and then onwards, because I saw the connection. For example, Pedro Serrano Lactau, for example, the structure of the grammar was very similar, or is very similar, even identical to the ones published during the last phase of Spanish presence in the Philippines. So that's one important piece of information. The second one is that well, yes and no. Yes, because you see that some examples were actually taken from the grammars. No, the Pedro, is it Pedro? Yeah, Pedro is what I use, right? That name also comes from the Spanish of Nebrija, the Gramática de la Lengua Española. And then I saw grammar books of Philippine languages using Pedro also. So, and then I say no, because when I was younger in grade school, I don't know, maybe those teachers were just mistaken. They were still associating the inversion signal I with the verb to be. No, ako ay kumakain, I am eating. Okay, when already in 1610 with that Tagalog grammar, there was already a consciousness that there's no such thing in Philippine languages. No, that there's no such thing as a substantive verb. So what I'm saying is that some have benefited from the works of those Spanish missionaries among contemporary linguists. But maybe because of the language barrier, which is a very big barrier. We're not getting all the descriptions, all the discoveries that those missionary grammarians made during the time. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Wait. Some other questions. For Sir Chan Plerigo, could you please clarify in the comments what do you mean by language governmentality? Do you mean the theory of government and binding? So was there an observation of language governmentality during the early times of Nebrija and the early Tagalog regional languages? Maybe this is about syntax, sir. Government.
Language, government. Yeah, in fact, they use the term government because remember that towards the end of Spanish presence in the Philippines, they were already using prescriptions from the Spanish Language Academy, and I saw, the thing is, we didn't have enough time to cover syntax, that they were talking about government. They were talking about, actually, if you look back to the grammar of Nebrija, you'll see there already you see there already emerging, okay, the concept of binding of government in language. It's not really a new thing, right? It's not really a new linguistic phenomenon, but we have Chomsky putting it in more scientific terms, easily understandable by contemporary linguists.
Okay, sir. From Michelangelo de Jesus, what are the greatest influences of the Spanish language on the local languages in Mindanao? Or did the Spanish language really prosper in Mindanao? I've noticed that most historical accounts focus mainly on Luzon and Visayan regions.
Yeah, because remember that evangelization started with Cebu first, and then the Spaniards went to Manila, 1571. And then from there, going down the south. So earlier, when we looked at the geographical spread of the languages studied, most of the languages are Luzon, really. And then you see also that the major languages, most of them are from Luzon. So what we're saying is that the greatest concentration of Spanish speakers, the Spaniards, was really Manila, and then eventually Visayas, and then Mindanao. The Jesuits went there. It's just that very few missionaries, and then 1898 came. Now, as far as influence is concerned, we know that Tagalog and the other languages that we have a lot of Spanish borrowing, Spanish loan words. Right now it doesn't occur. I don't know if there are even syntax also affected by the Spanish language. So it's just the nature of events at that time. So greatest concentration was Luzon, then a little in the Visayas, although Legazpi landed there first, right? And then Mindanao much later. So nothing we can do about it.
Okay. Next question from Ms. Gracia Perdiguera. How will this study on languages contribute in solving the problem of multilingualism?
Okay. First, I don't think multilingualism is a problem. In fact, it's a solution, right? So, as a matter of fact, well, I gave a lecture on bilingualism, multilingualism in Indonesia just recently online. And what I got from my research is that now actually the goal of language teaching is no longer just learning one language, but the goal is bilingualism, right? You don't abandon the language that you are born with, your native language. And so okay, so that's what I know. Multilingualism is now a problem. Now, okay, so this study has an effect. Actually nothing, because what we studied was, okay, major languages. We know the history why major languages became such, right? So because of the support given by, unfortunately, not the civil authorities, but by the missionaries. They were in one mind, one heart in learning the language, beginning with the Synod of Manila. So I don't know what effect it would have on the so-called multilingualism problem. But okay, so I have a different idea. Multilingualism is a solution. Earlier we were talking about the MTB MLE project, and I think it's a recognition that really the thing to do is to become a multilingual, to become a bilingual. It has a lot of advantages. You can go to Google, to YouTube, and you'll see a lot of videos really praising those who are multilingual. Sorry.
Yes, exactly, sir. The more languages you know, the better it is. Okay.
Right, and I'm unfortunate because I only know Tagalog of the Philippine languages, but I know Filipino. So how many Philippine languages do I have?
Theoretical question. Okay. Sir,
Okay.
from Miss Julia Magno. So did the grammarians recognize the presently debated noun-verb distinction in the Philippine languages? If yes, how did they tackle nominalization of verbs or the verbalization of nouns? Very linguistics question.
Yeah, that's right. Very technical. Okay. So in the formation of verbs and the formation of nouns, actually what they did was to extract the so-called the affixes, right? And in describing all those affixes, the grammarians would also say, okay, so this word, this root becomes a verb, this root becomes a noun, etc. So it's all there described. It's just that we don't have time to discuss everything. Actually, I tried several times already to present something as technical as that, but really I can do that only in a paper, not in a conference.
Or probably a next lecture, sir. So you can really see the next lecture. So you can see the importance of the affixes when it comes to word formation.
Yeah.
If Miss Tina Gallego. Tina, did the Spanish scholars make any comment about the language ecology of the communities? The grammatical descriptions at that time and even up to now focus on describing one particular language, but in reality, multilingual communities have different languages in their repertoire, and this may affect structure and actual language use. Wondering if the Spanish acknowledged such diversity in these communities.
I would say so, but they were just concerned about dialectal differences because I mean I understand they were just describing the major languages of the provinces that they went to. Now, as far as multilingualism in one place, so we have that problem solved more or less by the consolidation of the lenguas generales, but I don't remember having read something said in the grammars themselves about, okay, so what happens with the contact happening among those languages that are present in a specific locality. Sorry about that, Tina, but I promise I'm going to look for that information when I read the grammars again. There are a lot, huh? so I really I mean, it's a research that begins, and I don't know when it's going to end.
Sir, from Ed Chico, could you give some examples of important research gaps in the field of missionary linguistics in the Philippines that could be filled in by scholars in the future?
Okay, research gaps. Research gaps that yeah, definitely they have a lot of gaps because the linguistics was not well developed at that time, although we saw that developments in Europe were actually happening here as well, no? So those as far as linguistics per se is concerned, I don't, maybe there are a lot. I just can't identify them. But if you're talking about research gaps as far as missionary linguistics is concerned, there's a lot because I looked at the library, I looked at the literature available, and there are very few studies about the grammars that we have. How many grammars were there according to the statistics? We saw 125. Now, some of them, most of them are still existing. Okay, and then very few. There are a lot of researchers doing the same thing in Europe. No, because there's a movement. I don't know if it's a movement, but there's a group of professors in Europe, Spain, the northern Europe. They gather every 2 years, I think, in a conference called Missionary Linguistics, and what they're doing is they're studying the not only the grammars but the vocabulary. They're trying to do what I tried to do today, which is to bring to light discoveries that they made centuries ago, but unfortunately forgotten. Forgotten because of the bad fame of traditional grammar. So they were saying that traditional grammar that's wrong because it's based on Latin and Greek and Spanish, and then you're applying that on native languages that have nothing to do. Of course, I'm just exaggerating. Nothing to do with Latin and Greece. So as far as gaps in research, as far as missionary linguistics is concerned, as far as the grammars and vocabulary that were done in the Philippines were concerned, a lot of gaps, and we need a lot of linguists to focus on that area. It's called missionary linguistics.
Okay, so anyone interested to also enter into studies
can work with me.
Missionary. And collaboration work with Sir Arvin Vivar. Okay.
Yeah.
So actually, don't have time for any more questions. So I would just like to ask Sir Arvin, is it okay to send me questions via your email?
Yeah, sure. What email am I going to use? I can give you my UP email.
Okay.
I give it to you now. I'll give it to you now. It's amvibar@up.edu.ph. Standard formula.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir. There are several comments here. Thanking you for the lecture.
I thank you very much too for having me.
Oh, Sir Arvin Vivar, best linguistics expert in the world.
Why was that?
Comment, sir. Yeah, thanking you about the lecture.
Okay. Salamat.
Okay. Tapos din po.
Natapos din.
Okay. Before we... Well, thank you once again to our participants for the questions. May we ask Dr. Victor Paz of the Archaeological Studies Program. He is the son of Dean Paz for a short message.
Okay.
No, sir? Hi, good afternoon po.
Good afternoon. Wait. Okay.
Hi, sir.
Hello, Arv. I'm well, of course, I first on behalf of my mother, who was listening very closely to your lecture, Dr. Vipar. It's just that she cannot express verbally what she's thinking, but she will definitely. First, thank you profusely for giving your time and effort and your scholarship in giving this lecture. It just goes to show, even for a a topic like linguistics during the 19th century in the Philippines, up to the 19th century, as you said, there's hardly anything we know. Even in a thumbnail presentation, it's just not enough time. But it also goes to show how deep your research is, your scholarship is on this subject matter. And we thank you for that, because as you said, and as what's coming out of the discussion and questions, there are so few who are putting their skills and their intellectual capabilities on historical linguistic topics. But let me just say in 3 points what I think my mother will say as a response to your wonderful lecture. First is that it is totally a wonderful lecture because she loves the idea of interdisciplinary. That's our goal, but at least multidisciplinary research. But in your case, I think it is closer to an interdisciplinary approach. You approach it as a historian, but very much rooted into the technicalities of linguistics. And that is a very important and rare type of research indeed. The second one is the emphasis, well, in a very subtle way, but all across your lecture, of how, and it's part of your takeaway, of how we must remember the transformation of our language or culture is also due to these efforts of the missionaries and the way they decided formally and consciously in teaching or learning, and then learning and then teaching the Christianity and the gospel and Iberian ways in the local languages. So that's a very important point, because then we got to that point which you underscored, that they realized that the languages that we have are all, they seem to be very similar. And this is now the groundwork for, as you know, for the later research on the construction of the Austronesian or the mother language concepts, which is again one of those major cornerstones of historical linguistics research in the Philippines, which my mother was very much involved in. And lastly, it's your second takeaway is a very important one, and I know this now in the clamor of people talking about federalism, and people talking about in order to create this argument, they throw into the arena this misplaced criticism of lingua franca, and this misplaced criticism of multilingualism, and most importantly, that Filipino is Tagalog. So so the idea that in the process of evangelization, in the process of 3 centuries plus of education from the standpoint of the Spaniards, the Tagalog language grammar was not imposed aggressively on the grammar of the other languages. So that means really the basis of 20th century research on the existence of a national lingua franca is in a better foundation. And I think that is a very important insight that you have. And I hope that we see all of these insights in more publications and listen and more people hear your insights on this very important research in the days and months and years to come. Congratulations again, and again, thank you
very much.
Thank you very much in behalf of my mother for presenting this wonderful work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Paz. Both Dr. Paz, Dean Paz, and Dr. Victor Paz. Thank you also, and happy birthday.
And let me thank the Department of Linguistics for again holding this honorific biannual lecture in honor of my mother, and for that wonderful artwork that was a gift from the department given today in honor of my mother's birthday. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome, sir. And thank you po once again. Okay, at this point, we would like to present to our speaker a plaque of appreciation for delivering the lecture today. To award him is the chairperson of the Department of Linguistics, Assistant Professor Jem Javier, and together with him is also Dean Det Abrera.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Hello po ulit, Dean Det. Sir Arwin, thank you so much. Happy birthday po kay Dean Consuelo Paz. Thank you po for speaking on behalf of Dean Paz, Dr. Victor Paz. Maraming salamat po. Kami pong mga kaguruan, faculty and staff of the Department of Linguistics ay buong puso nagpapasalamat po sa lahat. Una po kay Director Cecilia S. De La Paz ng Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts, sa staff din po ng UP Diliman OICA at sa bumubuo po ng UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival 2021. Nagpapasalamat din po kami kay Dean Maria Bernadette L. Abrera ng College of Social Sciences and Philosophy sa pagiging supportive at pagiging emergency techie ngayong hapon pong ito para po mag-navigate nitong StreamYard. Nagpapasalamat po kami sa bumubuo ng National Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. Ganun din po sa lahat po ng tagapakinig at tagapanood po ngayong hapong ito. Higit sa lahat po, maraming salamat din Consuelo Paz sa inyo po namin ipinapangalan itong lecture na ito. Kulang po itong lahat ng event na ginagawa po namin para maparangalan po kayo. Salamat din po sa pamilya ni Dean Consuelo Paz sa pakikipagtulungan din po sa department para po maipagtagumpay po natin itong event na ito kahit may pandemya, kahit may lockdown pa rin, part 2. Nice po present ang plaque of recognition. Nandito pa po sa office pero ipapadala na po namin sa opisina ni Dr. Arwin Vibar. Okay. Ito po yung ating traditional na plaque. And I would like to read the citation po. I would like to read the citation. University of the Philippines, Diliman, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, Department of Linguistics. This certificate of recognition is hereby given to Professor Arwin M. Vibar, PhD, of the University of Asia and the Pacific for delivering the second Consuelo J. Paz Lecture entitled A Thumbnail Sketch of Philippine Linguistics During the Spanish Colonial Period, in celebration of the UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival 2021, organized by the UP Diliman Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts and in solidarity with the National Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. Gusto ko rin pong i-cite na ito pong Consuelo J. Paz Lecture ay na-conceptualize also as part of the Road to 100 projects of the department dahil po centennial celebration na po natin sa Department of Linguistics sa susunod na taon, 2022 po. Given this 19th day of March 2021, signed by yours truly, Jem R. Javier, Chair of the Department of Linguistics, Dr. Maria Bernadette L. Abrera, Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, and Dr. Cecilia S. De La Paz, Director of the Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts. Maraming salamat po ulit. Kasama ko po in spirit ang aking mga kasama sa department. Nasa Facebook po sila at nasa YouTube. Nasa virtual studio rin po sila ng StreamYard. Thank you so much po. Happy birthday din, Paz. Thank you, Sir Arwin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Hindi pa po tayo tapos, sir. Marami pong salamat ulit sa lahat ng mga nubalo. Meron lang po tayong ilang announcements bago magtapos. So, you can also participate in the upcoming activities of the UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival 2021. You can visit their FB page at UP Diliman OICA, OICA. Also, registration for Cycle 2 Asian Language Extramural classes will start on April 11. For those who are interested, you can enroll classes on Bahasa Indonesia Malaysia, Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Thai. So please visit the Extramurals FB page. And for upcoming activities and discussions on linguistics, you may follow the UP Department of Linguistics Facebook page. And don't forget to answer the evaluation form for your certificates. Please make sure to check how you encoded your name. Say automatic yun. And the certificate of attendance will be issued for those who attended live, and you have an hour after the session to request one. Okay? Okay, so now we're officially ending. Thank you once again, Dr. Vibar, and for everyone who joined us today. And we hope to see you all again in the future events of the UP Department of Linguistics. Thank you.